In Ecclesiastes, chapter 2, verses 10 to 11, it says this: I denied myself nothing my eyes desired. I refused my heart no pleasure. My heart took delight in all my labor, and this was the reward for all my toil. Yet when I surveyed all that my hands had done and what I had toiled to achieve, everything was meaningless, a chasing after the wind. Nothing was gained under the sun. You can imagine that when Solomon wrote these words, he was akin to a modern day wealthy man who had everything money could buy. He had access to all kinds of power and privilege, knowing that there were no barriers to accessing whatever he wanted, and no one would be brave enough to say no to him. And he always had access to more than he needed or wanted or could use in a lifetime. Yet with all that he had amassed, Solomon was dissatisfied. He noticed that joy and purpose, passion, future, hope, and love could not be found within all that he had acquired. And his conclusion is that all of this stuff, the accolades and the prizes, that all of it is meaningless. These were the words that I recently recited at a wedding. Right. So the groom asked me to do something that was a little bit unusual. Sorry, getting lots of feedback. So the groom asked me something that was a little bit unusual. He said, you could, if you wanted, just go and use one of those regular passages that people use, 1 Corinthians 13. But he said, I think that what I want is for you to, sorry, he's just trying to fix the levels. I think that you should try to preach from the book of Ecclesiastes. And so that's what I did. Now, if you have read the book of Ecclesiastes, you see that it is written by Solomon, and most likely written close to the end of his life. And it's littered with the pronouncement over and over again that everything is meaningless, futile, and empty. Well, almost everything, but we'll get to that in a moment. Solomon is the son of King David. He was, as some would say, given the kingdom unfairly. He wasn't the firstborn or the next in line. Instead, he's the product of this illicit relationship between his father and mother. His birth is preceded by lust and greed and murder. Yet at his birth, God bestows on him this name that indicates he is loved. Today's passage, the one that Keith just read, outlines when his father hands over the kingdom to him just before his death. But this is not without its drama. His brother, Adonijah, has already attempted to lay hold of the kingdom. And what you don't see in the passage that was read this morning is the scene found in 1 Kings chapter 1, as two brothers battle for the kingdom. Adonijah senses that it is his right and tries to take the throne by force on his own, only to have his father announce that it is Solomon who will reign. This begins or continues a feud between brothers that leaves one brother dead along with his supporters. The author recording this in what is now known as 1 Kings says, so the kingdom was now firmly in Solomon's grasp. This is the first of many things that Solomon will acquire. In 1 Kings chapter 3, Solomon marries the daughter of a pharaoh, yet another acquisition. And as you read through his story, you see that acquiring women is one of Solomon's hobbies. He has 700 wives and 300 concubines. Listen, wow. My husband and I were just having this conversation yesterday. He said, women are a lot of work. And I just don't think he could imagine having more than one. So when you have that many people, I don't know where the line draws, who's a wife, who's a concubine, and why it matters, but at 1,000 women. Now, I don't want you to imagine that Solomon is some kind of romantic. Rather, I want you to see him as a conquering king. And women are plunder. Women are contract negotiations. They're ways to seal the deal. And one by one, he adds them to his harem. Now, the difficulty with a harem like Solomon's, besides the number of women, is that the women come from this range of backgrounds and cultures and ideas, and they then pass those on to Solomon. And it's often noted that Solomon's marriage to these women was what led him away from faithfully serving God. Now, the irony in the story is that before the announcement of his many wives comes into play, it's already noted that Solomon loved the Lord and followed the decrees of his father, except he offered incense and offered sacrifices at the local places. In other words, early on, Solomon worshiped God and worshiped idols. But despite his dual attention, it's noted that God approaches Solomon in all the finesse of a genie in a bottle. And I wish I had put that on my slide, but I forgot. And he asks this question. He says, whatever you want, you can have it. Ask me. Doesn't that remind you of the movie Aladdin when you grew up? Growing up, maybe when I grew up? Just have to rub it, shine it. Doesn't work that way anymore, apparently. Can I have just the wealth and fame part, that's all. And so he says, whatever you want, it's yours. And the text notes that Solomon asks for wisdom, or as Brueggemann notes, he seeks a heart that listens, or a heart that understands. And then he also gets wealth and fame, which is all very ironic. Now, Solomon is also noted for building the temple in its grandeur and a number of exploits that expand the kingdom. But as the story comes to a close, you see that God is less than happy with him. At the end of his reign, and rather than how he responded to him at the beginning, specifically because of personal idolatry, which we would presume then invites the nation into idolatry as well. So Solomon is told at the end of his reign that the kingdom will not completely pass on to his heirs, but rather, under his son, we see the kingdom tear into two, Judah and Israel. Now, when I read about Solomon, I'm often left perplexed. Why is Solomon rewarded? And is wealth and fame truly the highest sign of wisdom? What about the women he takes on? What about the death he inflicts for the sake of power? Why does God overlook his early dalliances with outside worship, but then condemns his later ones? All questions that the text doesn't quite answer. But if you read enough about Solomon and recent scholarship and look at what they've learned through archaeology, it becomes clear that some of what is written about him simply can't be supported by what is found in the research. And so it's presumed that either the text struggles with placement and language and dates, or that maybe the scribes chose to elaborate the text and to take license with the story of Solomon, making him greater, making him grander, making him more of a hero than he probably was. Now, one author, Kalimi, notes, he says, outside of the Bible itself, relatively little hard evidence survives for reconstructing his life or deeds on a historical level. Unlike several other Israelites and Judahite kings, there is no direct mention of Solomon in any surviving contemporaneous extra-biblical source. And the archaeological evidence that could be related to Solomon is open to interpretation and widely disputed among scholars. But before you go and just rip out those first 11 chapters out of 1 Kings, take heart. Kalimi also notes, and others note, that while the evidence might be spotty, to completely dismiss the biblical account of Solomon is probably not the way to go. Brueggemann, a well-known Old Testament scholar, asks this about Solomon. He says, do we take the narrative at face value as a belated fabrication, or do we read the text ironically? And perhaps we're invited to option D, which is all of the above. Now, to erase the account is too dismissive. To ask good questions about the account and to read it in the shadow of scholarship seems to be a safe place to land and learn as ones who choose to have a high value of Scripture without leaning into the dangerous territory of inerrancy. Now, approaching the story of Solomon with the expectation that accounts of his grandeur might be hyperbolic, while holding on to the reality of his existence as a historical figure and asking questions along the way, is also a way to hold on to the text without needing it to become something that it is not. But for the sake of today, I think it's fitting for us to reconnect back to Ecclesiastes. Now, Solomon's wealth may not have been as much as is noted, but he was wealthy. The extent of his power and prowess may be embellished, but he was powerful. His account of gaining wisdom may very well be accurate, but it may also be a necessary account to assure the people that he was indeed sent and chosen by God. Yet there is evidence that despite his dream, he did have good questions, he did have deep thoughts and the heart of a philosopher. And so I think his end-of-life account in Ecclesiastes is the best way to reflect on the life of Solomon. He notes that everything is meaningless except two things: the power of connection with one another and the power of connection with God. He notes that someone standing alone can be defeated, but that two can stand back to back and conquer, and three are even better. And if you follow Solomon all the way to the last chapter, he speaks again of something meaningful and suggests that one should not forget their Creator. When I catch those two phrases, immediately I am reminded of the book of Mark, as a religious leader asks the question, of all the commandments, which is the most important? To which we know that Jesus says everything is summed up in these two statements: love God and love your neighbor. Now, these are some of the most quoted passages, and yet some of the most difficult to live out. After all, what does it look like to love God? What does it look like to love our neighbors? Now, 1 Corinthians 13 does give us a picture with that famous chapter where it talks about us being invited to kindness, forgiveness, and patience. Nonetheless, being defined by these words, love God and love your neighbor, when all of life wants to define us, is difficult. And I think that is what Solomon comes to understand at the end of his life. He could be defined by his political strategies, his accomplishments, the development of buildings, communities, and a kingdom. He could be defined by his wives, the women he acquired, each a sign of something significant he had accomplished or avoided. He could be defined by his wisdom, the way he ruled the people. But at the end of his days, he sees that all of it is meaningless. And he can narrow meaning down to these two important junctures: relationships with God and relationship with others. And I think that Solomon, centuries before Jesus makes that same pronouncement, seems to grasp what each generation must learn for themselves. That while everything is meaningless, love makes it meaningful. What does that mean for our work? What does that mean for our wealth? What does that mean for our fun and for our lament? What does that mean for our families? What does that mean for our circle of friends and community? What does that mean for us? Perhaps hidden within the story of Solomon and within his combined reality and mythology as it collides with what we know about Jesus, maybe there, hidden in plain sight, is an invitation to make meaning. Thereby, an invitation to love those around us deeply. For so long, it felt as though to love God and others was this reprimand, this impossible dream. But the more I ponder about what it means to follow Jesus, what it means to put God first, is the less I imagine that there are checklists and rule books. And the more that I imagine we are invited to experience love so that we can be a part of another's experience with love. In other words, as we experience both knowingly and unknowingly the deep love of God, this has the capacity to more deeply cultivate our connection with the Creator, thereby empowering us and transforming how we cultivate connection with one another. But this is deep soul work, And it's something that's both personal and communal. It's individual and congregational for a family and for a neighborhood. God at work in and around me, God at work in and around us, shaping us, moving us, and making meaning out of everything that is meaningless. Because it's no longer about climbing higher or gaining more or achieving what's next. Instead, it's about connection with God and connection with others that results in transformation of places and systems and persons and situations. I once listened to this speaker, and he was talking about legacy, and then there was a small group of us who were discussing his conversation. And one of the questions that emerged was, did your family ever talk about legacy? Was that something that you discussed growing up? Now, everyone was kind of said no, and then I said, oh, yes. I said, absolutely. In my household, my parents insisted that our lives were intended to create something. We were intended to become something, to do something that would positively impact the world around us. And when they became Christ followers, it was this immediate connection to belief and action that really shaped the trajectory of their lives in good and perhaps not so good ways. Now, the good was that they invested so much into the church, in their community, and in individual lives. But they also sacrificed a lot to do this. And sometimes I'm sure that it felt more like something that they must do or that they had to do, rather than that it was something that they wanted to do. Something that came out of that deep love that they knew and experienced and then wanted to pass on to others. Sometimes it was simply their way to earn their way to heaven. But in the mix of the good and the bad of it all, what emerged were their children, with these ideas about social responsibility and having hearts of advocates. But even in this, there is this danger for everything to be meaningless. Yes, the notion of orthodoxy is important, right belief, but also the notion of orthopraxy, right action. But I think each of these miss something essential when love is removed. Paul may have noted that when love is removed, everything becomes like a resounding gong, empty. But when our desire to understand and know God operates outside of love, we can end up with so much focus on the rules of it all that we can miss out on godliness and ignore the needs of the people around us. All for the sake of upholding the rules, of upholding traditions, of upholding ways of being that no longer fit or were never necessary to begin with. And it's here that we need the reminder that Jesus gave when he said that the Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. Likewise, when our desire to do good or be good operates outside of love, we end up with so much focus on accomplishment and production that we can also miss out on godliness and ignore the needs of the people around us in order to elevate our own sense of worthiness or mission. Consider when Jesus had to correct the disciples when they thought that the only people that could do good were themselves. When they saw other people casting out demons and doing good works within the name of Jesus, they condemned it and they told them to stop until Jesus corrected them. But what happens when our belief and our practices are joined together by love? Well, I imagine that somehow, in the mix of it all, we discover that everything on its own is meaningless. The suffocation of others and self with rules, and the burdening of others and self with the need to perform good works as tools of redemption. But what emerges when we choose love as the modus operandi for our beliefs and our actions? It's there that we find ourselves invited to live life through the lens of Jesus. And it becomes less about us. It becomes less about our checklists and our rule books, less about measuring up, and more about the small whispers and actions and words of transformation that happen within us and spill out all around us. When all of who we are as individuals and as a church and as a community become more about Jesus and subsequently, undeniably, and sometimes even unintentionally, more about love, this is where transformation happens. So for all of Solomon's foibles and upsets, for all of his gains and seeming successes, for all that he achieved and built and brought to life, he leaves us with this final thought. A thought that I hope will resonate with you throughout the week as you work and build, create, achieve, and worship. Everything is meaningless until love makes it meaningful. What will we participate in making meaningful this week? How will we, because of the choice that we have made to be defined by love, how will we change how we work? How will it change how we engage with our family? How will it change how we view our achievements and our success? How will it change how we view and use our wealth and power, privilege, status, and position? How will it change us from self-righteousness and selfishness? May we be defined by love, noting that God is love, thereby participating in small and large ways and announcing that everything is meaningless until love makes it meaningful. We're going to close the service with a moment of reflective prayer. And so I'm going to invite us to pray with a small opening liturgy. And then I'm just going to leave a small space for quiet, or if you choose, loud prayer. And then I'm going to close us off with a word to send us into our week. Creator God, you call us to love and to serve you with body, mind, and spirit. Through love, your creation, and your sisters and brothers. Open our hearts in compassion and receive these petitions on behalf of the needs of the church and the world. Let us pray.